I would argue overall literacy, that sounds that people can read. It's not that people
Sure.
can't read, but there is a sense that the more developed one's critical thinking skills are, the less likely they will fall subject
Mm,
to the mis and disinformation. And that's simply because they are trained to look at sources and evaluate whether they are trustworthy, where the information comes from. The things that we are teaching our students to be critical consumers of any kind of information. So, not just social media
yeah.
information, but really anything.
Welcome to Diving into the Discourse. My name is Javier Rojas, and I'm with seasoned political science professor Alexandra Macias, and today we're discussing misinformation during the election. So let's jump into this, Alexandra. Tell me a little bit about yourself and your time here at CSUN, and what do you focus on?
Sure. So I was hired at CSUN in the fall of 2000, a very long time ago. And when I was initially hired, I was hired as a political science and sociology professor to teach research methods. So that's been one of my main areas of focus in my time at CSUN is teaching research methods. In terms of my own interests, I have had a number of different research projects that range from talk radio when I first started graduate school to more recently looking at master's degrees programs and how well they serve our students. So I've had a lot of different interests, and all of them have been connected to my teaching focus, which is research methods. But I also teach a media and politics course in the Department of Political Science. And so that is, in fact, I'm teaching it this semester. So the topic today is very, very much on point for where my reading has been.
So I think the topic of misinformation is something that we've been hearing around for a number of years, but I think it came into the American focus. It felt like in 2016 when President Trump came into the picture. What has changed since that period until where we are now? Where we're talking about politics and misinformation.
Oh, so much has changed. I would almost argue some for the better. And I have actually, it's been in this last month where there were a couple of things that have happened, which made me think, you know what? I don't want to say we're turning a page because we're not, but there's an awareness that is at such a higher level today than it was in 2016. And I'll actually point to the vice presidential debate that just took place last night. And more specifically, the fact that one of the candidates made mention of an agreement that there
Mm.
was not to be real time fact checking during the vice presidential debate. And I thought that was extremely interesting because it suggests that not only is there an awareness of misinformation, but there is now, I don't want to say a social stigma, but it strikes
Mm.
me as a good thing that people are aware it exists and don't necessarily want to be tied with it. I would also say that what struck me with the same candidate was they had an interview on CNN. And during that interview, the candidate implied, or didn't imply, but came out and said, I needed to make this story up, or admitted to
Yes.
making the story up, that cats and dogs were being eaten in Springfield, Ohio, and that there was a need to do so that the topic could be discussed.
Interesting.
So those two instances really made my head swivel because on the one hand, there's a recognition that there's misinformation and there is a lack of desire to be associated with misinformation. But at the same time, there's an acknowledgement of its use. And the way that I see it, if there is something that is in our society that is now being increasingly perceived as negative, that really is a good sign, especially if it is a negative thing.
Mm.
So I see this in a positive way, but that doesn't mean that the problem doesn't exist.
Yeah.
And it doesn't mean that the problem is even bigger than it was in 2016. It just means that in terms of our society, and not just our society, but many across the world, this is something that people are now aware of and paying attention to.
Interesting. I think there's some people would say there's a negative connotation with the word misinformation. People want to say misleading even.
Mhm.
What do you think about that? About the way you describe it? Because the misinformation people will like shut you down in a way. I think that's something that I've seen. What do you think?
Yeah, yeah. Actually, it's interesting. Again, I'm teaching media and politics this semester, and in my lecture in class yesterday, we were discussing a couple of chapters from a book that's called Fake News.
Hmm.
And I assigned a couple chapters out of this large book. And the chapters that I assigned included one of them, which actually describes what is referred to as information disorder. Okay. And what the author goes through is different kinds of information disorder. So when we hear the term misinformation, at least the way that this book indicated or defined it was defined as false information shared by someone who believes it to be true.
Hmm.
So if you, and I actually did this in class yesterday. I shared a news story and I got one of the locations wrong. And I actually sent my students today a fact check. And I said, given during the lecture that I said something and gave the wrong location, here's the actual article that has the actual information. So I corrected the record. That is different from what the author of this chapter refers to as disinformation, which is false information shared with knowledge of its untruth or lack
Hmm.
of truth and intentionally shared. So there is an intent that is different from misinformation. So misinformation is simply the wrong information that is shared. I did that in my class. Occasionally news outlets will do that if there's a breaking news
Hmm.
story. They'll share something, they'll get the information incorrectly. Disinformation is more of a deliberate sharing of false information. And then there's a third category, which I had never actually heard before until I started teaching out of this book, called malinformation. And the idea of malinformation is information that's based in reality, but the intent in terms of sharing it is to do harm. So, in terms of what we are understanding with respect to information disorder, we can look at different levels of where it comes from. In other words, is it a mistake? Is it constructed in and knowingly false? Or is it true? But the intent will determine its essential purpose.
Hmm.
So, do you mistakenly share something? Do you share something on purpose that's false to harm? Or do you share something on purpose that's harmful in order to harm? So, there's so many different levels around this phenomena. And I think that's an interesting takeoff point in terms of understanding what we're talking about.
Interesting. So we have misinformation, disinformation, and malinformation, correct? So,
Mhm.
with all that being said, who is who is going to be the arbitrator of finding the truth in this? I think it's hard because, if my mom, who's not that great on Facebook, is going through this feed, who's going to be to decide the truth on this? I think that's what people get angry about. But fact checking.
Yeah, yeah. And actually, and that was something that, so going back to your initial question that had to do with 2016
Yeah.
and the presidential election, there were a number of deep dives into what actually happened. And you may remember at that time, Zuckerberg from Facebook testified before Congress. Facebook made these changes with respect to posting information, or one would get a little notification that this might be false. Those were the days when Twitter would essentially ask you, do you really want to share this?
Yeah.
It may not be true, or you didn't read the article or something like that. So there was a lot of emphasis with respect to the social media entities. And in fact, if you look at the major entities like Meta, which was Facebook, or X, which was Twitter, or YouTube, or Reddit, TikTok, Snapchat, I'm going through, there's so many of these things. The sort of largest entities, so Facebook or Meta, I should say, and YouTube, they have very lengthy policies that speak to the prohibition of sharing misinformation or disinformation related to the election. So places like YouTube, places like Facebook, places like Instagram, they will have this policy that prohibits that. The policy extends to whether ads can be purchased related to electioneering. So there's a lot of work from the sort of media venue side. But one of the things I also tell my students is when we talk about the media and its connection to politics, if we're only focusing on the media, we're only focusing on part of the problem. Another part of the problem is the audience, as you might rightly point out. And often the audience doesn't do its own fact checking. And I've told my own students a story. In fact, I did this in 2 of my classes this semester. It was based on a Instagram reel that somebody shared with me that was around the time of the Olympics. And this reel alluded to is actually something that Oscar de la Hoya did. He spoke about the women's boxing controversy in the Olympics. And one of the things that he did in this reel was mention, or as he said, that it's not fair to have male boxers, quote, fighting in a female category. And when this was shared with me, my jaw dropped and I thought, what the heck is this? So I then looked up the source information on the Associated Press. I got a PBS news story from the PBS News, and I put it all together and I shared it with both of my classes. One was a 100 level class, so freshmen, sophomores, and the other one is a 400 level class, my media and politics, so juniors and seniors. And so I showed them the original reel and I asked them what they thought. And they gave me their opinion of what they thought. And I said, well, if you see this, and many of them understood that the information that was being shared was incorrect. But I asked them, okay, well, what would you do if somebody showed you this? And not a single one said that they would go and actually research it the way that I did. And I said, so you would just keep scrolling through? And they said, yeah, we would just think it's crazy, but keep scrolling through.
Interesting.
And that's the problem. That the problem is that people can be presented with information from a source that ostensibly is an authoritative source on a particular issue. Obviously, Oscar de la Hoya was a boxer. And just not question it. That's the problem. And that's not necessarily the social media problem. That's on us.
Interesting. So, and correct me here, did they acknowledge that the information was wrong? Was that correct?
Oh, yeah.
But yet they still proceeded with their day, whatever, and didn't.
Oh, that's what they said. Yeah. Because I said, I asked them, how often do you see things like this?
Yeah.
And of course, all the time.
Sure.
And I said, so if you see something where you think to yourself, okay, wait a minute, this doesn't smell right somehow, what do you do? Just keep scrolling through.
Okay. So I guess my question is, one, do we as individuals have a responsibility to go and find the right information? And second, do we have the ability to go, complain about it to the companies or flag it for misinformation? So that's a two-pronged question, but do we have a responsibility here?
Yeah. So and both prongs I think are appropriate. So number one, I do feel that we are responsible for what we, one always says one's responsible for what they eat and one is also responsible for what they bring into their mind. So if we're consuming information, much like we consume food, we should understand where it comes from. And if it doesn't smell right, literally, if it doesn't smell right, then we should look to see if it is in fact good. I think that is something, and I actually think there's hope that can be done if one looks at large projects to get public opinion to change on things like smoking, for example. When I was in college, it used to be the case that there would be smoking areas on campus. In fact, when I came to CSUN in the year 2000, there were designated spots on campus where you could smoke. It wasn't by the air conditioning intakes, but it was okay to smoke on campus. But over time, and as the public has become informed about the dangers of secondhand smoke, people started to pay attention to that. And I actually think the same sort of thing could be done as it related to misinformation and disinformation. So that's one of the prongs. The second prong, as it relates to the responsibility of social media entities, is that where they seem to be limiting themselves in their policies has to do with election coverage. So I know that the focus, in terms of this particular discussion that we're having, will resolve around the elections. And in that particular area, I mentioned that these social media entities, not all of them, there are some that don't have policies like that. I'm not going to name names, but there are some that don't have policies. But by and large, they do seem to be unified around the idea that it's important to halt the spread of mis and disinformation and malinformation as it relates to the election. So they are on all on the same page, not all, but those who have policies are on the same page there. But my example relating to the De La Hoya reel doesn't fit under any of those
Yeah.
policies. And there is a whole lot of that information. And that is in every way as corrosive as misinformation and disinformation as it relates to elections. So I do agree that pressure should be increased on companies in order to essentially moderate their sites like they used to. They just don't do that anymore.
I wonder, is there a walk back from those practices because of the political nature that we're in right now? Is where do people start falling away from that?
I think and let me just say this. It's also in the what we would call the legacy press
Mm.
or the, old press, if you will, old media. There has always been there have always been attempts to fact check. I can
Yeah.
remember in the 1980s that one of the most negative presidential elections up until 2016 that I can remember was the 88 presidential
Mm.
election where it was Dukakis versus Bush. And that was the election in which you had the Willie Horton ad and just a whole bunch of negative ads. And what was also ushered in during that time period were these fact checks on political ads. So news programs would do fact checks on political ads and let people know this is true, this is false. And there was a continuance of that practice. But what ended up happening in 2016 is that the sheer amount of
Mm.
misinformation, disinformation grew. And the reason why it grew so quickly was the way in which it was transmitted. So social media allows for a quick transmission of information that can also have a much larger capacity than these legacy media sources. So going back to this book that I was lecturing on yesterday, there was a quotation referencing the BBC, or British Broadcasting Corporation. And they had discussions early on, right after this fake news era started, if you will, in 2016, where they deliberated, do we have to, or do we fact check every single story that we report? Because the outcome of that might be that if we don't fact check a story that happens to be false, right? If something gets past us, then people are going to believe it to be true. In other words, if you put onto journalists the responsibility to fact check everything, then people are going to expect it for everything,
Mm.
which then means that there is a certain cyclical effect that journalists are now going to be spending time fact checking stories and perhaps not actually reporting on other stories. So there is a huge load of information that is probably a little too much for journalists alone to do fact checking on.
How has this election cycle gone in terms of combating misinformation so far? What are your thoughts on it?
For the Harris and Trump debate, there was real time fact
Hmm.
checking during the debate. I know it's not the first debate to have employed that, but it really was something that was pointed out when people at home were watching, that they knew it was happening. And like I said, Vance's comment just last
Hmm.
night saying, hey, we weren't supposed to be fact checking. That to me says that we are turning a page in terms of it is now, I don't want to say expected, but it has become a common practice that fact checking takes place to the extent that we see it in real time. We didn't used to see that. We would watch debates or we would hear a speech, and after the speech, you would have a fact checker come on. But I've now seen both debates and speeches given where there would be at the bottom of the screen some kind of fact checking going on in real time.
How does AI fall into this now? I know that that's something that people are barely getting to accept. You know, this technology is out there and it's going to be used for good and then sometimes bad. One of the first things think of is Donald Trump's tweet. I think of Taylor Swift, something that she endorsed,
Right.
which is fake, and that was AI. What are your thoughts on
Right.
AI when it comes to misinformation?
Yeah, well, number one, okay, so I just want to say, as a side note,
Yeah.
I mentioned that a lot of the social media companies do have these policies that specifically rule out different types of mis and disinformation, including what they call altered images.
Hmm.
So there is an actual in a lot of these policies and that I actually think extends past elections. So that is one area where it's not just based on, okay, this has to do with politics, but they do have policies that prohibit the use of altered images like what you're
Yeah.
referring to, the Taylor Swift one. It is the case that Truth Social does not have that particular policy, just so you know, just for the record. So that is something on social media that would become harder and harder, or that is something that's recognized, that is a sort of line that the social media companies are not going to allow people to cross so readily. But I'll talk about also what the average person thinks about ChatGPT,
Hmm.
because we do know that younger people are more likely to use ChatGPT, as they are more likely to use social media as a main source of their news. So this is in much the same basket of information. There is a difference, however, and let me just say, I get a lot of my information about social media and about misinformation and ChatGPT from the Pew Research Center, which does a great deal of research on media habits, media usage in the United States. And this year, they have looked at social media usage, whether or what percentage of people in the United States use social media as their main source of news, and what people in the United States think of ChatGPT.
Hmm.
And what they came out with this year was a small study that indicated that trust in ChatGPT as a source of information is actually not as high as you might think. That they quoted saying that 4 out of 10 people do not trust the information. And quite frankly, most Americans have not used ChatGPT. So it may well be out there, and unfortunately, if you do I guess a Google search, it's gonna just automatically go into Chat GPT. But it's not at the point where people just trust it automatically. So that is something where there could actually be some movement to make sure that it doesn't get out of control. And in fact, I think there's been some work up in the California government, in the state legislature, and the governor's office to pay attention to it. So I know that is something that will be focused on moving forward.
Interesting. I'd like to see where this topic is when it comes to AI misinformation in 2028. I'm sure things are going to change by then, but
Hopefully.
yeah. This is kind of connected to this, and you brought it up earlier. When it comes to the topic of media literacy, I think
Mm-hmm.
these with misinformation and media literacy have, they go hand in hand here. How important is it for this next generation or just youth in general that are coming up to be media literate and whatever they see to investigate and look into it? I'm very interested in that.
Yeah, I feel that it is one of the most important things that we as educators can emphasize, especially in a course, especially in my media and politics course for sure. But I'm also teaching Political Science 155, which is Intro to US Government. And so that makes all the sense in the world to introduce it in that course. And I've done that. One of the things we know about media literacy is that there is something of a connection to just overall, I would argue, overall literacy. That people can read. It's not that people
Sure.
can't read, but there is a sense that the more developed one's critical thinking skills are, the less likely they will fall subject
Mm.
to the mis and disinformation. And that's simply because they are trained to look at sources and evaluate whether they are trustworthy, where the information comes from. The things that we are teaching our students to be critical consumers of any kind of information. So not just social media
Yeah.
information, but really anything.
Yeah, and how I would assume as youth are using phones more younger than ever, or they're getting these trends. Many of them are obviously not familiar with traditional news media. I think I speak to some youth, and it seems like that's a practice that's not in their world, or just it just feels outdated to them. So my thought would be, okay, they're getting most of the information off of Instagram, Reels, X, Facebook. Uh, is that just something we have to accept, that they're going to be going to these mediums, and part of that there comes some risk as well?
Yeah, it's very convenient to pull out your phone and
Sure.
get a push notification. And in fact, I do that. I don't even have a paper version of the newspaper. I probably
Mhm.
stopped about 4 years ago, but I do subscribe to three newspapers and I do get them on my phone. So I still, quote, read newspapers, although during the day it will be on my phone. I am fortunate enough to teach political science students who get a lot of the same kind of notifications from
Okay.
legacy sources. So it's not unheard of in my particular department, but I can't necessarily speak to everyone. I am a mother of four children, and only one of them is a political science major. So my other children went to college with other majors. And I know while they pay attention to the news, it's not at the same level of actually getting a newspaper subscription and having that come to their phone.
Sure. Interesting. Habits are changing, and I think we're all gonna have to adjust somehow. And I think these companies are hopefully gonna have a say in this. They're gonna go towards the truth. Trying to dispel any disinformation, misinformation, or malinformation. Uh, Looking at the so going back to the election here, recent polls have shown this thing's pretty close. 50-50 seems like, it's just like a toss up so far. We have so many swing states that are up in small margins. Where does misinformation fall into this? I feel that there's going to be a sizable population that's going to fall into maybe a lie or something, and it might have an effect on the outcome of this election. Where do you stand on that?
Right. So this actually, again, this ties into my media and politics class. One of the units in the class that we go through is a component that references the effects of the media on individuals. And when I start that component of the course, I reference the idea that there are different information strata in society. In other words, when we look at society, we can classify people according to what you would refer to as media literacy. So at the sort of very apex of a pyramid, if you will, are what we would call the attentive public. So the attentive public, those are the people who regularly follow the news. They tend to have higher levels of education. They don't just follow the news, but they follow it across different media venues. And that's a hallmark of this attentive public. So they might get news from, quote, social media, but they also read newspapers. They might listen to a radio news, they might watch television news, but the hallmark is multiple media venues. And I make that also clear to my students that when we talk about media, it's not just particular sources like ABC News or NPR. It's also venues. So it's radio, it's
Mm.
television, it's social media. And that combination, the venue plus the organization, has a huge influence on the news product that comes out. So if you're part of the attentive public, you are getting multiple sources, meaning multiple organizations, and multiple forms or products. And what that does is that insulates you from the misinformation or the disinformation. Occasionally, there is misinformation. There's a mistake that gets out. I did that in my own class, so we're not infallible, but one is less likely to fall prey to that. So that part of the population, they are going to be consistent voters. Okay. And we could refer to them as likely or voters who go all the time. They tend to have higher levels of political interest, and they are by and large made up in terms of which way they will vote. So when you look at the polls and you see certain percentages that indicate that they would support Trump or certain percentages that would support Harris, those are our likely voters or our attentive public. But after that group, and we'll say that group is, let's say, 20% of the population. Okay. After that group, you would have what we refer to as the latent public. So this is a group of people who will get information from a news source. So they might watch television news, or they might, have a social media site, but they aren't as let's just say news junkies like your attentives. So they follow the news, but what happens with them is once they are activated, if you will, so they go from latent to being activated. Once they're activated about something, they will follow the news as closely as the attentive public. So they can be turned on to a story if something hits that's of a high level of salience. And that's probably about 25% of the population.
Okay.
So within that group, you'll have some voters. You might have a couple of undecideds, but it's our third category. And our third category is not the attentive or not the latent, but the sort of inattentive public. So they are people who will vote, maybe. They will probably not pay as close attention to the news. But given that it's an election year, they might have a sense of, okay, it's civic responsibility. Mr. Wood in middle school said I should vote when I'm a grown-up, so it's now time for me to vote. And that's the part of the public that would be most susceptible. There is a fourth category, and that's what we would refer to as the apathetic public. And those are the people that really don't care about politics, aren't registered to vote, don't follow any public affairs, current affairs. We all know people like that. It's a much smaller group.
Yeah.
Those are the ones that, to even get them to the polls would be amazing.
Yeah.
So it's that third group where you're going to see the most susceptibility to the misinformation or the malinformation or the disinformation.
Very interesting. So if a voter in one of these swing states hypothetically sees a post saying Kamala Harris is going to raise my taxes, of course I'm gonna vote against that. And on the other side, they see that Trump is full on, for tax cuts for the rich, and they're going to vote against you. So people could fall into either side, but that's a very interesting.
Yeah. Well, and it's important to understand, right? Everything that I've said there puts the responsibility on the people themselves and their level of media literacy. So if you are a person who you don't go out of your way to look at multiple sources of information, and by that, I mean, not just, okay, I'm watching ABC or I'm watching, Fox News, but it's also, I'm going to read a newspaper. So if you only stick to one media venue, you're likely to miss something. And that's the point about media literacy, is don't just limit yourself to one kind of media venue. Listen to a podcast, read a newspaper, and then go on social media. Do something like that.
Yeah, seems like there's more work to be done than just taking one source in. With all this being said, where do you think the topic of misinformation is going? Just let's fast forward to the next 4 years, this next election cycle. Do we have a bigger responsibility to combat misinformation? Where and who are the leaders taking the lead on this?
Right. So again, I referenced the idea that there was just a bill up in Sacramento that the governor did not sign into law. And this particular bill was one that would put some regulations on artificial intelligence. I don't believe that particular issue is dead. So there will be more bills forthcoming. So, and let's just also put on the record here that in California, we've also had laws passed that have protected our information. So if you're in California and you go online, you are always told that this particular site saves your cookies. Do you want to opt out or not? It's California. It's not the entire United States, but it's California. So I would argue that at least in our state, there are some people that are paying attention to this. And given the economic power of the state of California in terms of the U.S. economy, if not the world economy, it is definitely the case that legislation that passes here may not immediately be passed everywhere else, but it does enter into the public debate. So what we could do as citizens or residents of California is we can contact our elected representatives and say, hey, this issue is something that's of importance. And since California does have a record, at least in terms of examining these issues and passing legislation to counter it, I think that's a great place to start.
Is there anything you want to add on this topic that you want to highlight, or something that we missed?
I think we missed much, but I do want to say, although it does seem very bleak, and
Yeah,
every one of us, I think, knows somebody who shares information without
of
caring,
course.
without caring about its validity or not. I do feel very positive that more people are at least aware of this, and I do think that's a step in the right direction. So don't lose heart that in terms of everything will necessarily get worse. It doesn't have to.
Yeah. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Javier Rojas, and this is Alexandra Macias. Thank you for your time. This has
Thank you for
been,
having me.
of course, this was Diving into Discourse. Have a good day. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us for Diving into the Discourse. You can watch and listen to more of our podcasts on the CSUN Conversations website and become part of the CSUN Conversations community.